Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of RChain, including our foundational language, Golang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
So we kind of went out to the stratosphere over the last few podcasts, and I wanted to bring it back home to the very practical, which is building applications on top of RChain. I know that you've done a lot of work with the RChain asset tracker backend. Recently, you and Kent went and did some bug hunting, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your adventure and what brought it about, and how you guys ended up resolving the matter, and how that RCat fits into the whole ecosystem here.
I think it was version 9.3 or maybe 9.92 of our node. We started seeing some what we thought was race condition, basically intermittent results in testing RSong and RCat infrastructure. Without getting into a lot of detail, the way RSong and RCat persists assets into blockchain, in particular into RChain, and then tracks them is through our node and through our node APIs, in particular the deploy API and finally the propose API. In order to save bandwidth and throughput and be more efficient, we bulk the payloads. So what that means is instead of just doing one asset at a time and storing it on the chain and finalizing it, we stream it and then we bulk it into, depending on the circumstances, depending on what else is going on, into anywhere from a handful of assets to 100 assets. And then we do a deploy and do a final propose. So as you can imagine, when we start debugging, it's going to be kind of hard because you got to iterate through that bulk list to figure out where things went wrong. And that's where a lot of the debugging was coming into picture. What we were seeing was some of the deployments were getting through and some of them weren't, and then it would pick up again. So it was intermittent, and that naturally, after talking to Kent, talking to you, going through the logs, we were leaning toward the race condition. But as Kent and I dived into the code, debugged it, we just couldn't identify any race conditions.
I remember I was looking at the Golang code going, there's no race here.
Yeah. So the Golang code is, you didn't see one, we didn't see one. And interestingly enough, this is the same Golang code with very minor modifications since day one. And so I was kind of hard pressed to imagine it's from there. So we were looking at all the hard places to figure out where this thing was coming in. And then finally, Kent had the aha moment. Basically, it turned out that as part of the deploy model, one of the parameters was expecting, even though the type was long, but it was expecting an integer, and I was passing it on max long. And naturally, that was creating an overflow in some of the deploys. And in addition to that, some of the exceptions weren't coming up into the console, and that made the debugging harder. But once Kent identified that, he was able to fix that part, add additional logging, and now we get very nice, concise error messages when such things are occurring. And at the same time, the team is looking into changing the type so it would be more declarative as far as what type of parameters need to be passed in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that that I was grateful is, if it's responding that way, it probably was swallowing an exception, which is dangerous,
right?
At a minimum, and so it was really good to find this particular roughness around the edges early, because these kinds of swallowing exceptions lead to these erratic behaviors that look like race conditions when in fact they're integer overflows or things like that. So yeah, it was really good that we found this and sort of started to shore up that piece of the API.
I totally agree. And I mean, I'm just repeating what you have been saying. I think, there is a lot of different opinions about RSong and RCAT, but I think from day one significant value, it's been an extremely valuable way for us to measure performance, testability, and all different aspects of our chain, our node, and our infrastructure. It's a lot of code. And so it would be, no matter how much we try and how many unit tests and integration tests we have, unless you put it into real life dApp development, you won't really know. And I think that's where RSong has been valuable.
No, I agree. Absolutely. One of the ways.
Yeah, one of the ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, that debugging, which Ken definitely taught me a lot of valuable lessons. It also opened my eyes into how the persistent model works, because that's where we thought the race condition might be coming from. So I started looking in that part of the code, in particular RSpace, so much so that I joined the RSpace team to start doing some of the core platform development, which I'm extremely grateful and excited about.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a powerhouse team, to say the least, but it's great to have you on board there. That's really good.
Yeah, it certainly is a powerhouse. I mean, I've been doing software for a long time, and this team is awesome. It's really a pleasure to work with them. It's an honor.
Tell us a little bit about the RCAT deployment and how people might use RCAT.
Yeah, so thank you for asking. That's a really good question. One of the things we've been working on is to make the deployment model of RSong, and in particular the infrastructure RCAT and RNode, more seamless. And what I mean by that is, what we want to do is have a deployment model for RCAT, and at the same time, RCAT by itself is not going to work. We also want to have a deployment model for RNode where we bring a number of nodes up as validators and then have RSong start interacting with those. So these two are kind of wired together. And our approach is, RCAT builds everything on Google Cloud. Could as easily do it on any other cloud, but we chose Google Cloud. And the whole thing is basically boils down to a number of declarative YAML configuration files. Once the code is checked in, there is a cloud build YAML file that Google Cloud picks up and start building it, builds a Docker image. It basically builds everything inside a Docker, and then it publishes it into a Google registry. We don't have any dependency on any particular build machine since we build inside Docker. And we don't have any particular dependency on any infrastructure because we deploy as a Docker image. Hopefully that made some sense.
Oh, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I guess that means it would be pretty easy to deploy this on Azure, for example.
Yes, it would be very easy to deploy on Azure. It would be very easy to build it on Azure as well. So both, for that particular reason that we build and deploy as Docker images. It's interesting that you mentioned Azure, because when I was looking for references as to how to build this, a lot of the material that I looked from Helm and Helm charts and Kubernetes and Google Cloud infrastructure were coming from Azure. They're heavily into this way of building with zero dependency on platforms.
That's awesome. That's cool.
Yeah. What we had to do was add 2 more of these descriptor files, these YAML files, to the main RChain project. So now as RChain is being built, we also build our node inside GCP, inside Google Cloud, and then register those images and then deploy them. And with the SRE help, in particular, Tomasz, we have a handful of Python scripts that we've added to this. Basically, once the dev branch in RChain is checked in, these build scripts get triggered. The associated Docker image will get registered with Google Docker Registry, and then they get deployed into a Kubernetes cluster where we have persistent storage for our node. And we basically form 3 or 4 validators. It's configurable. We haven't really tested it to that extent. So that takes care of our node deployment. And at the same time, every time, same philosophy applies to RSong and RCAT. Once the code gets modified and checked into GitHub, we start building and deploying through Google Cloud, and we deploy to Google Cloud, and then these connections just start working. And everything is hot deployment, meaning there is no downtime. That's one of the nice things that we get from being able to run in a Kubernetes cluster, as well as being able to handle with the volume of load. We haven't done a lot of experimentation with being able to scale up and down with RNode yet. The RNode part is work in progress right now, so stay tuned. I'll keep you up to date as far as our progress goes. That's basically where we are.
Are there materials where someone who might want to take RCat and tweak it a little bit and turn it into something else? Is that available? Do we have any documentation, or is that something we still need to cook up?
So the answer is yes and no. I need to spend more time on documentation for that very specific use case that you just mentioned. There is some, but it could use some love.
Understood. Well, we've got a lot of irons in the fire, so
Yeah, but certainly one can take, and as long as they replace every time they see song or music, just replace that with an asset, with a binary asset, then yes, then that should work. But I do need to add more documentation to add more color to that part of it. However, as we've discussed, there is really no restriction whether these are songs or images or videos. There is no restriction there.
Basically, any digital asset, it seems like, and it's not just a digital asset. It's like it's a packaging of a digital asset, right? So it's digital asset plus metadata associated with it. Is that correct?
Yes. So the way it works, we try to loosely couple different aspects of RCat and basically look at things as different entities or different assets come at different times from different locations, and there would be a manifest file that would declaratively tell us how we can aggregate these different parts into products or into assets. So for instance, as you mentioned, a song could have a couple of binary representation of the actual music asset, and then it will have a metadata. And the manifest file will tell us for this song, these are the particular parts that need to exist in order for this song to be publishable in terms of, I'm using some of the RCat terminology. So at the acquisition part, we look for this manifest file. When the manifest file exists and we realize that all the parts are there, we provision the asset. The act of provisioning an asset means that we have all the parts and we can formulate a product. And once it goes through that pipeline and we vet that everything is valid, the metadata is valid, we know this asset, we know the owner of this asset, and all the things are lining up, now the asset becomes publishable. When an asset is publishable means it's searchable now. Basically, at that time, the asset has gone through the entire pipeline and is ready to be consumed. And we're keeping track of all this as well as the consumption patterns through the contract. Tokens are associated with the consumption pattern, and those tokens are managed through the contract.
Yeah, that's great. It feels like a pretty comprehensive architecture. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is there's sort of two aspects to digital assets. One is, when the digital asset is the thing in itself. So when we're talking about a song or a video, the digital asset is a thing in itself. But sometimes the digital asset is a record of another thing. For example, when you're talking about telecommunications, oftentimes you'll have these digital asset databases of actual network hardware. So that's how people keep track of what's out in the field. And it sounds like, based upon the way you've done it, the publishable part could correspond to, yes, we've done a verification that in fact the record corresponds to what we normally check to see that the record is faithful to the representation in the field, which is often an important thing, right? Because sometimes, an engineer will change out a network part and forget to update the database,
Right.
or they'll update the database before or in advance of actually getting a part out to the field. And so they have to go through this process of verifying that there's a faithful representation of the record to the physical asset. And it sounds like the way you've organized it, that would be easy to kind of slot in.
Yes, exactly. That use case could be met. I can't tell you that we're doing that today. We need to add a little bit of coding to do that. But the whole concept of separating the provisioning and publishing is to address such use cases.
Mm,
The one that I had in mind in particular when I was doing this was these assets a lot of times have policies that are associated with them,
mm,
as far as where a certain asset can be consumed, what time they can be consumed, in what dates, expiration dates, start
mhm,
date, so forth and so
mhm,
on. It's a prudent approach to separate the whole concept of provisioning and publishing.
mhm, mhm,
Um, you could provision the asset even though the policies that are associated with it may dictate that this asset cannot be seen in such and such geographical locations. So the publication will be basically focused on publishing it in certain other geographical location. Or you might want to temporarily do a takedown on an asset. Even though it's provisioned, you want to take it down because there is some controversy or whatever.
mhm,
So
mhm.
it's a prudent approach to separate them to address the very use case that you mentioned and these additional ones as well.
Yeah, and those kinds of use cases, they span both the digital asset domain, which is, I think a lot of people are familiar with, a takedown on YouTube, but also the a physical service kind of access where you sort of in telecoms, we know what it means to kind of deny service because someone hasn't met a billing requirement or whatever it is. So yeah, this is great. This sounds like it's moving in the direction that supports a very wide range of use cases. Another aspect that I think about is, and I know there's a lot of debate on this. Why would one put data on the chain? And I know for myself, I don't think it's a necessary component for certain kinds of applications. When we were first contemplating this, quite apart from the fact that we just wanted to show off that RChain could do this, the debate that needs to be covered is if you don't store these assets on chain, that means that some third party is holding the assets. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about this? And even Derek, what do you think about this idea of being beholden to a third party versus community ownership of the data?
We're seeing on a regular basis the problems of centralization of ownership of data. When you have one point of entry for an attack from a hacker, then that's it. They have everything that you need. To me, being a year in this industry now, one of the most important evolutions of this entire data structure and everything that's happening with blockchain is the ability that hackers will no longer have one point of entry. Besides that, do you really want one person having control of all of your information? I was listening to Michael Lewis's new podcast where Citigroup was hacked and someone got control of his social security number and was able to rack up $16,000 in charges that had nothing to do with him. But now for months, he's been trying to get this problem taken care of. And the law right now puts the onus of this completely on him, not Citigroup for being hacked. So everyone wipes their hands clean and his credit score has been ruined and he can no longer take out loans or anything of that nature because people were able to get into one point of entry and then basically ruin lives. So from my perspective, that's one of the most important aspects of what we're doing here.
Mm. Yeah, I have similar kinds of concerns. There are also other concerns, like there are data sets that are terrifically sensitive. One of the attacks that Lawrence Lessig talks about with respect to blockchain is what happens if someone attempts to store child pornography on the chain? Does that infect the whole chain? And the interesting thing is that if you have the entire community is essentially footing the bill for the data, then you can also point the finger. You could say, this is the community that's footing the bill for this data. Without going around identity concerns, you can give a lot of information to law enforcement with respect to sensitive data if the community is responsible for maintaining the data, because now they're the ones that have decided that they want to support the data being there. If there isn't something like that, if it's squirreled away in a dark hole on the internet somewhere, it becomes a lot harder for law enforcement to go after. Now, of course, if it's just a single point of entry, you might argue that might be easier to track. But my sense is that if there's a larger surface to go after, that gives law enforcement a better shot at being able to track down the sensitive data. At a minimum, I think it's worthy of debate. And I think that's the thing that's more interesting to me, is that we're at a point now where we can have these kinds of debates. Before, when it was just sort of the Google, Facebook, Amazon model, we couldn't really have these kinds of debates. And that's the interesting thing, blockchain and in particular RChain, where you've got the kind of scalability that makes things possible. Now we can actually open up the debate. But Kayvon, any thoughts from your side?
The part that concerns me a lot, everything today has been really, really consolidated. You run on AWS or you run on GCP. There is nothing else. So they can dictate as to a lot of the things that you just mentioned. I definitely don't want to wake up one day and then realize that Amazon has a different policy, and now that all my assets that have been stored on Amazon would have to comply with some policy that they've decided. I look at this thing, first of all, as an awesome technical challenge that's extremely intriguing. And at the same time, dereferencing and getting rid of this third trusted one individual or a handful of individual party, for me, is extremely valuable, particularly where I came from, my background and all that. It's very, very intriguing for me. And I definitely feel better where that third party is a community where I'm part of, whereas a community that I had to join because I had no other choice, or I was born into it, or any other circumstances like that.
Yes, I certainly understand what you're saying, and that sort of speaks to kind of the geopolitical appeal of blockchain in various regions around the world. I wanted to ask one last question, which is, what do you think about this kind of approach to a blockchain-based GitHub? One of the things that I'm most interested in is how do I say it? I wake up often at night going, what happens if GitHub says, we think your code is very valuable to you? Shame if something happened to it.
Right.
I've been wondering about RChain and the blockchain in general as a next generation code repository. I mean, it certainly is going to be that way for smart contracts, but not all code is smart contracts, right? So there's going to be lots and lots of code which are digital assets that are not smart contracts. And I kind of wonder if we think RCat might also be the basis for a code management system, or a code check-in system.
I have the same concerns. I mean, when it wasn't too long ago when GitHub was purchased by Microsoft, I'm not saying anything one way or the other about Microsoft, but the very fact that we woke up one day as people that depend so much on everything that we do on GitHub, and the ownership changed right beneath us, it kind of puts those kind of thoughts that you just mentioned in our head, that we have no saying on any of this. So yeah, it's quite possible tomorrow a different owner comes in, or a different policy gets exercised with GitHub, and we may or may not agree with those line of thoughts, but everything that we do from the time we wake up till we go to sleep is in GitHub. It is for me, and it is for you, and it is for almost all developers. It is a scary thought, and I think if we take the technical aspects of GitHub out, it's a social sharing, gathering, tracking, versioning, asset type management. It's a perfect match. It's a natural fit for blockchains, where communities can collaborate and vet on certain things, whether it's code or music or asset, it shouldn't matter. I'm totally with you on that concern. that it is a huge concern, and I think that blockchains are positioned well to provide those kind of functionality as GitHub does, and I think that's the way that we should move. As far as RCAD goes, I mean, at the end of the day, if we take all the fluff out and just look at the kernel of it, it is an asset tracking system. It started as a POC for an asset tracking system, and then we added more functionalities into it so we could do acquisition. We added more functionalities to it so we could easily deploy in any environment. We basically added more layers to it, but at the heart of it, it's an asset tracking system, and it's really geared well to do those kind of things as GitHub does. Naturally, it would need more love to get there, more development, but the kernel is there. I'm definitely on board on that initiative. It is a scary thought that we rely so much on something that's owned by one corporation.